Hi everyone, and welcome to this lesson looking at patterns of achievement by social class, with a particular focus today on the concept of material deprivation, but we'll get to that in a second. For your starter, what I'd like you to do, please, is a one-sentence summary of the key studies we've looked at so far. It's so important that you go over these studies on a regular basis so that they become second nature to you and you can retrieve that information from your brain as quickly as possible. So what I'd like you to do is write a one-sentence short bullet point summary of what each of these people said about education. Now, I know we've looked at Parsons on the family, so not family, no warm bath theories here, please. But what did each of these people say about the purpose and role of education? You've got 3 functionists and 3 Marxists. Try not to use your notes, see how much you can remember, but if you do use your notes, please write it in a different colour. That's for you, so that you know which bits you weren't sure on and what you need to revise. So if you pause now and write a one-sentence summary of each of those theorists and their views on education. Okay, so some answers. Durkheim is a functionist, and he believed that education performs the function of providing people with specialist skills. So we need to learn things in school that help us to get particular and specific jobs when we leave. And also it performs the function of social solidarity. So school and education bind society together by things like assemblies, teaching us values, British values like tolerance. And don't forget, he believed the most important subject was history, because by learning our shared past, it binds us together. Parsons was the idea of the bridge, that school provides a link between the world of the family and wider society, and that's secondary socialisation. It teaches us how to follow the norms and values of society in a safe environment that's linked to the family. Davis and Moore were sifting and sorting, what we talked about in terms of role allocation. The purpose of education for Davis and Moore is to sift and sort people into the right jobs. School is a meritocracy. If you work hard, you'll get a good job and you'll be rewarded at the end. Bowles and Gintis are Marxists who believe that the education system mirrors the workplace. Okay, so they said that all school is doing is preparing you to go to work to make money for the bourgeoisie. Althusser was the ideological state apparatus. Schools brainwash us. They turn us into passive robots willing to do what the bourgeoisie want us to do. And Paul Willis was the study of the lads, the boys in school that he followed, who showed that we're not as passive as Althusser said that we are, but yet still capitalism works, and those boys ended up in working class jobs when they left school. So what we're going to look at now for the next couple of weeks is how different groups achieve within the education system. So how achievement varies by things like gender, class and ethnicity. And the first one we're going to have a look at is social class. So pop your title down. It's got today's date on, which I need to take off, but you'll cope. And get the LO down as well. So pause and write those down. So first thing I would ask you to have a little think about is what social class you are. Are you working class? Are you middle class? Where do you think you fit in the social hierarchy? And the chances are you're probably not too sure. And that's kind of the point of this exercise. Most people aren't too sure about what their social class is. And your idea of working class might be different to my idea of working class. Similarly, your idea of middle class. And where we draw those lines and those barriers might change. So one thing sociologists do when they're trying to measure social class, and it's not a perfect method by any stretch of the imagination, is they use income. So they use family income to judge what social class or what social grouping, and they call them socioeconomic groupings, somebody might be in. In education, students don't have an income, so it's really difficult to measure the social class of a student because we don't necessarily know what their family earns. So the way that sociologists measure and the way the government measures who is a more disadvantaged student, who is perhaps more working class, is that they use the measure of which students are in receipt of free school meals. So free school meals, you'll have heard a lot about that in the news lately from Marcus Rashford and things like that. It's a really simplistic way, and it is flawed, and there are problems with it. But essentially, if a family income is below a certain level, children are given extra help with the finances of attending school. So that means the school gets an extra little pocket of money to help that child with things like school trips or books or the things that they might need in school. And one of the parts of that is that they get free meals given to them during the school day. It's a simple way of measuring things, and there are flaws to it, but it does give us a total measure of the whole population. It tells us exactly whose family income falls under a certain amount. And the argument is that those students whose family income is a little bit lower might find it more difficult to do well in school. And we'll explore some of those reasons why. What we're going to have a look at now are some sources of data, so some charts and tables that talk about and show us what the patterns and trends are in terms of which students are doing well in school and which ones perhaps are not doing so well. Now, these are just patterns and trends. This is not picking out any individual student or saying that any individual student is going to get a certain grade or not. What it looks at is all of the students in the UK in those categories and how they did in their GCSEs in those years. And if you have a look, you've got the dark blue for 2016 and the light blue for 2017. The dark blue, we won't look at so much, but let's have a look at the light blue because that's the most recent and up-to-date bits of information. On the left-hand side, the first three columns are FSM, so students in receipt of free school meals, those who have a lower family income. And then the right hand side is all other pupils, so any students not getting free school meals. And what you can see are some particularly stark and interesting trends. In 2017, 40.3% of children getting free school meals passed English and maths at grade 4. For children not getting free school meals, it was 67.4%. 10%, we won't worry too much about the EBAC, in fact, but what we can see there is a big gap between those children who get free school meals and those who don't, and the likelihood of them passing English and maths at GCSE. This graph looks at students going to university, and what it does is it groups students by the area that they live in. So certain postcodes are associated with being more or less disadvantaged, and you can even Google your postcode if you wanted to find out what kind of group you fell into. And the graph is quite straightforward if you have a look. Purple at the top shows that in 2006, 40% of children from most advantaged areas went to university, rising to almost 50% in 2016. For those from more disadvantaged areas, it's just over 10% in 2006 to just under 20% in 2016. So that shows that the more advantaged, the more wealthy your area, the more likely you are to go to university. This is another graph showing GCSE. So before we had numbers 1 to 9, we had grades, obviously A star to C. And this graph quite clearly shows the blue bars are children in receipt of free school meals, and the red is all other students. And in 2013, 2014, 70% nearly of children not receiving free school meals achieved 5 A star to C GCSEs, but only 41.6% of children in receipt of free school meals. So there has been a gap for quite a few years in terms of progress. What you can see there as well is progress in English and progress in maths. And again, the blue and the red show free school meal and non-free school meal children, and the likelihood again is lower for free school meal children. I find this table absolutely fascinating, and what it does is it records the number of professionals in top jobs, so the top people in their field, by what kind of school they went to. So an independent school is what we might call a private school or a public school, one where you have to pay to go. A state school is like the Warrener, one that's free on entry for everybody. In the UK population, about 7% of people go to a private school. Okay, so Blockton, for example, is a private school. 93% of people don't, and they don't pay for their schooling, and they go to a state school. But when you look at the people running the country and the top jobs that they have, it's quite almost scary at the percentages that are dominated by those from public schools. So when it comes to the judiciary, which means judges, okay, and barristers, only 7% of the population went to private school, but almost 75% of people in those professions went to a private school. When it comes to medicine, top doctors, 60% of them came from a private school. Journalists, over 50%. And if you have a look through all of those things, Oscar-winning film makers, Nobel Prize winners, the domination of the public school sector and the independent sector in the top jobs in the UK is quite scary. On the right-hand side, it even narrows it down to Oxbridge, which means Oxford and Cambridge universities. Just 2 universities dominate the law, dominate journalism, dominate politics. And what that's showing us is that those who can afford to pay to go to a private school or have the means to apply to the most elite universities get the best jobs in society. What I'd like you to do, and you can pause obviously, go back and have a look at any of the tables that we've kind of discussed. Can you write a really short summary, a couple of bullet points of what the patterns of achievement are by social class? Yes, it's really depressing, I know that. But can you describe, based on social class, which groups are more or less likely to do well in school? I'll give you a clue. Students from wealthier backgrounds are more likely to do well. If you do that really quickly, start to have a think. Why do you think these patterns might exist? So pause here and complete that task. What we're going to move on to now is to have a look at some of the reasons for this. So sociologists divide the reasons up to help them remember, and this we can worry about this later, but essentially you need to be able to draw a distinction between things that happen outside of school and things that happen inside of school. Mostly because that's how they phrase the exam questions, sadly. But they might say, explain some reasons from outside of school why working class children don't do as well as middle class children. And you've got to be able to write about the correct ones. So just have a think, jot down your ideas. Do you think things that happen at home or things that happen in school have more of an influence on how well somebody does? And then think about why. First concept we're going to have a look at, and it's an outside of school factor, so put a little subheading, is material deprivation. So material deprivation is one of the reasons why children from lower income families are sadly less likely to do well in school. Now I'm going to repeat, it doesn't mean that all students from lower income backgrounds don't get any GCSEs and don't do well. That's not what it's saying. It's just saying that they are less likely and perhaps things are a bit more challenging. Material deprivation means the inability to afford basic resources and items which can impact a student's educational achievement. And can you write down that definition? Pause if you need to. So it essentially means, deprivation means to be without something, to be deprived of something. And material means items or things or stuff. So if you have material deprivation, it means you are deprived of stuff. You don't have as many things. And that's because your income or your family's income is lower. Now this is confusing because education is free, isn't it? Or it should be. You don't have to pay to go for school. You don't have to pay me to be your teacher. That'd be nice, but you don't have to. Have a think about this question. Is education free? And can you make a list of all the things that might cost money that would support a student's education? and then have a think about your list. Does what you've written down, do you think money helps you to achieve? Does money make a difference to achievement in school? So one thing I'd like you to do to have a think about this on a bit of a deeper level is to create something that's going to also help you remember. So this is an outside of school factor. This is a home factor. So what I'd like you to do is to draw yourself a house. It doesn't have to be exactly like my house that I've drawn there. I haven't drawn that, I've copied that, but you get the idea. Have an image in your book of a house. And inside that house, I want you to annotate and label any material factors that you've thought of that might influence how well someone might do at school. So what are all of the different things that money can be spent on that might support someone doing well at school, or that someone who doesn't have those things might find things a bit more tricky? So for example, I'll give you 2 examples to get you started. The first one might be that there's a lack of revision books or a lack of books in the house to help with homework. The other thing might be that the family can't afford correct uniform. And that means that the child has a more tricky time when they get to school. Perhaps they're getting into trouble, for example. Okay, so have a think, pause here. How many different factors can you think of that might influence how well someone might do at school, that link to how much money they have? So here are some things that you could have thought of. So for example, someone who has material deprivation might struggle for the following reasons. Firstly, they might have fewer school supplies. So for example, not having enough pens, not having a ruler, not having a calculator. And that just makes life tricky. That tells a teacher certain things about perhaps their attitude to school that isn't their fault at all. And that means that they might get into trouble, they might have more detentions, and therefore their enthusiasm and their kind of levels of achievement at school are going to drop. Not having books, not having reading books for younger children and for secondary school children, but particularly younger children, not having access to books, not having access to things like dictionaries, for example, can affect older children as well. Uniform I've already mentioned, but not being able to afford correct uniform, or when uniform gets ruined or gets too small, what it can mean is that that child gets into trouble a bit more often. It sends an image to their teacher that perhaps they're not committed, that they're not organised, and again, it's not their fault. Houses can be overcrowded. Often children may have to share a room with siblings or more than one sibling. Maybe there isn't somewhere quiet to work, particularly at the moment with homeschooling. That's a particular issue. But overcrowding can be a big factor if someone doesn't have somewhere that they can sit down and quietly get on with their work. Cold and damp houses, because people can't afford to fix things or they can't afford to move, can lead to illness. And illness means absence from school. And it's really a simple equation, isn't it? If you're not in school and you're not doing your lessons, you're not learning. So cold, damp houses that cause illness can be a material factor that cause underachievement. Transport can be an issue. So if there's no school bus in your area, for example, or you're in the sixth form and you don't get a free school bus place, it might affect where you can go to school and how much you're able to get to school if there's a problem. Poor nutrition. Sadly, in our society, junk food and rubbish food is cheaper and more convenient than healthy food. And that means that some children have a poor diet, and a poor diet means that they often struggle to concentrate and maybe they don't do as well at school. Children from lower income families are more likely to need to get a part-time job as soon as they're old enough, at the age of sort of 15 or 16. And children who have part-time jobs, well, it can be really good for teaching skills like customer service and time management. If it's not handled correctly, it can detract from their ability to do well in school because perhaps they're tired, perhaps they don't have time for revision or homework. And the final thing that's been a real issue throughout COVID is the digital divide. And this is the idea that it's access to the internet, access to computing that has a big impact on children's ability to do well in school. And children from lower income families are more likely to have to share devices, more likely to have less reliable internet, and things like that. Final task I'd like you to do is I'd like you to tell me which of the material deprivation factors you think has the most impact on a child's ability to do well in school and why.